Just how bad has COVID-19 hit the Pittsburgh Penguins, and do the Penguins still have enough firepower to overcome that against the Wild on Saturday? We find out today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a special crossover edition of Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making both Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, both shows are free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins, we will preview the matchup between the Wild and the Penguins on Saturday night, gearing up with everything you need to know heading into the matchup between these two teams. We'll talk about the COVID-19 situation ongoing with the Penguins, as well as how these teams stack up head-to-head. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked on Wild, veteran Minnesota sports content producer with over a decade of experience under my belt. And I'm joined by the host of Locked on Penguins, Hunter Hodies. Hunter, what's happening? How are things going?
Not too bad, man. I know it's a perfect late evening on Thursday while we're doing this, but, I'm always a night owl, so it doesn't faze me at all. So
I feel like being a member of, especially during the season, being a member of the media, like you kind of have to be in order to get through the season unscathed. Yeah. And so, late nights are no stranger to either of us. But as we said in the open, these two teams are going to square off on Saturday. So wanted to get a little intel ahead of the matchup against Pittsburgh, because for the first time this year, well, actually it'll be the second time for the Wild, but first time in over a year going up against an Eastern Conference opponent. And so why don't we dive right in? We'll start with obviously the biggest news for Pittsburgh is continuing to deal with COVID-19. So Hunter, just get us up to speed. What is the latest with the Penguins dealing with COVID-19? Just how shorthanded are they going to be for Saturday's game?
Yeah, they'll be pretty shorthanded. I would say Sidney Crosby's not going to play. He has symptoms. Brian Dumoulin is not playing. Marcus Pettersson is probably not going to play. Trevor Weedle is probably not going to play. Mike Sullivan will not be behind the bench. That came out on Thursday. He now has it. And this is coming off of Jake Gensel had it to open the season. Chris Letang just came back actually on Thursday from having it. Jeff Carter had it, and Zach Aston-Reese had it. This was something that you probably would have seen last year, considering, with outbreaks and everything. Did not expect to see a widespread outbreak this year, when the whole team was fully vaccinated. But you know what? That's what happens sometimes with this whole thing. So, it's an unfortunate circumstance, but, they've been able to bank as many points as they can, which is it's a miracle that they have, considering they're also battling injuries with Brian Rust. Evgeny Malkin's out for at least one more month, though he's been continuing to really ramp up his skating. But yeah, it has been a mess with mostly COVID, but injuries as well. It has basically turned into a myth of if the Penguins will get healthy. It's not a matter of when. It's just an if at this point.
Jeez, there is nothing worse. And, the Wild went through this last year where they had, I think, almost 2 full weeks of games that were fully postponed, and then came back and caught lightning in a bottle after that. So hopefully the Penguins have a lesser extent, but just a more gradual run-in with COVID here this year. And you mentioned Chris Letang. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he had or assisted on the game-winning goal coming back off of the COVID-19 list, did he not?
Yeah, he comes back from COVID first game, plays 30 minutes, and scores the game-winning goal just because that's just who Chris Letang is. And it was a bit of the parallax angle came in. I know some people probably don't, have not heard the parallax stuff just because of the puck completely crossing the line and all that. But the ref were able to review it, and the puck completely across the line from Carter Hart, and the Penguins ended up winning in overtime. They probably should have won that game in regulation if it weren't for a Mike Matheson turnover. But yeah, Chris Letang his legend only continues to grow as he continues to have his tenure here. Just a magnificent performance from him coming off COVID.
Before we kind of open it up to some wild questions as well, just from the Pittsburgh side, you mentioned all the injuries and now COVID-19 being at the forefront. What has been, because Pittsburgh is off to a relatively good start, what has been kind of the saving grace of the team so far this season?
I would say it's kind of, two-facet. Tristan Jarry has silenced, me and I think a lot of other people in the fan base. I've said this on my shows probably 1,000 times at this point. They're going to get sick of that. I'll say this again. You're not going to write a redemption story after a month of playing, especially after what happened in the playoffs. But, I think people can take a minute and exhale a little bit just because he's not really making you hold your breath while he's playing. He was honestly, I think, the biggest reason why they beat Philadelphia on Thursday. He has, I believe, a .935 save percentage in 4 or 5 of his last starts. Top 10 in goals saved above expected. He is off to a great start this season and is, I think, again, shutting up a lot of people, myself included. They're getting a lot of depth scoring this year, which was a big question mark, I think, from some people. Danton Heinen has 4 goals. He had 7 in 56 games for Anaheim last year. Already has 4 and 9 for the Penguins. Evan Rodriguez has a few. Brock McGinn has a few. Teddy Blueger has also scored a bit. They're doing this with Jake Gensel, who usually you can pencil in for 30, 35 goals a season. He only has 2 right now because he's been pretty snake bitten. Kasperi Kapanen has not really scored. So they've been doing this a lot with, their depth scorers. And, again, that was a big question mark coming into this season. But, with how they've been able to perform, this team can honestly run 14, 15 forwards deep. Again, if they ever somehow are not sick or not injured. But I think those have been the 2 main things this year. And then, of course, Mike Sullivan has done a magnificent job coaching the squad.
Yeah, as somebody who has 2 players that I would say are very snake bitten in Kirill Kaprizov and Kevin Fiala with a goal apiece, I can definitely appreciate having some of the players a little lower on the team rankings step up and provide the scoring. So glad to hear, at least despite some of the external things with injuries and COVID, that the Penguins are able to get some good play from some guys that we maybe didn't expect coming into the season. Let's expand the discussion, and I'll give you the opportunity to ask a couple of wild questions before we move to looking at how these 2 teams stack up head-to-head. We will continue the Locked on Wild, Locked on Penguins crossover after this. It is Thanksgiving season, and that means it is pie season. And so if you are a fan of pies like I am, you can look for plenty of ways to try to cut a couple of calories and still get those delicious tastes as well. And I'm here to tell you that Built Bar is the way to do it. Built Bars are super healthy. They contain only 130 calories and just 4 grams of sugar a piece, compared to a slice of pie, which can have upwards of 300 calories. Yes, I know. They taste delicious, but at the same time, you can have 1 Built Bar for roughly a third of what you get in a slice of pie. So you can replace that coconut cream pie with a coconut Built Bar, or you can go the raspberry route instead of a piece of raspberry pie. There are plenty of great flavors to replace those sweets you love. Low calorie, low carb, low fat, high protein, covered in 100% chocolate. Built Bar is a great option not only to replace those dinner sweets, but also when you are on the go. It'll be a great option for Thanksgiving and for the Christmas season as well. So make sure to put a couple in your favorite relatives' stockings, because if you love Built Bar, they will as well. So head to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off of your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Continuing the Locked on Wild, Locked on Penguins crossover episode, Seth Topol joined by Hunter Hodies, and thank you for making both Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins your first listen every day. Hunter, let's get a little wild, and so I will flip it and give you the opportunity to ask a couple of questions so that the Penguins audience can get a little more familiar with how the Wild have been doing so far this year.
Yeah, so obviously, I think they've played pretty well out of the gate. From at least from the highlights I think that I've seen coming across my Twitter feed, they've won. I believe it's 6 out of their first 9 games.
Yep.
I'm not going to make that joke, but I have noticed. I think it was Kaprizov had his first goal. Well, I want to say it was the overtime winner, right? That he finally was able to, break that door open, and hopefully the floodgates start to come for him there. What is plagued. I mean, well, I shouldn't even say it's a slow start just because he's basically been a point per game player.
Yep.
He's had a lot of assists. Has it just been mainly bad luck with Kaprizov not finishing a lot of these chances? It sounds like he's been, on the plus side, with the underlying numbers and everything.
Yeah, it's been a weird start to the season for Kaprizov just because I think we are seeing a tangible increase in the amount of attention he's drawing from opposing teams. I mean, even on some of his just getting the puck into the opposing zone, there are constantly 2 players that meet him as soon as he enters into the zone just to try to take him off the play and try to take him off his game. Teams are way more physical with him this year, which has led to him getting frustrated and trying to kind of dish it back. So he has taken a little bit of an increase in penalties so far this year. And I think we have seen a little bit of line inconsistencies so far this year. The Wild tried to have Joel Eriksson Ek be the center on his line, which produced a sensational game against the Winnipeg Jets. But beyond that, performances have been very uneven. And so we saw in the game against Ottawa, we saw the Wild go to Freddie Gaudreau on Kaprizov's line, a former Penguin. And the results were way better. Gaudreau, I think, is a really good fit, and Ryan Hartman was on the other end of that line. And it just seemed like things opened up for Kaprizov. He was able to get the game winner. Obviously, that was thanks to, 3-on-3 in overtime. But I think it's been a combination of factors. It's been a struggle for me to say that he's slumping just because the guy motors all the time. And even if he's not directly involved in the play, he's still moving around trying to make things happen. And so hopefully, it was just a case of weird puck luck. We've had a ton of that this year. And that, a goal against Ottawa can turn into 6 goals in the next 4 games, something like that. And then everything will be just fine and we'll be able to move on from it. I think he's totally fine. I think Fiala is totally fine as well. The scoring chances are just inevitably going to be there if those guys continue to do what they've done so far this year.
Yeah, I mean, that's what usually happens, I would say, especially for any great player, the puck is going to find the back of the net sooner rather than later. You saw Jake Ensel, we talked about earlier, he finally found the back of the net after so many games while having 65% of the scoring share. And, just running into hot goalies, sometimes puck doesn't go in, people always overreact, but, it'll always go in. Freddie Gaudreau, obviously we know him very well. I think some of the Pens fans were definitely sad to see him go just because how good he was here as a 4th liner. I think he had 1 or 2 playoff goals, but also when, he was brought up from Wilkes-Barre, just added a spark to that bottom 6 that didn't exist before. So, I think, I and a lot of other Penguins, a lot of people that watch the team are very happy that he is playing well because, I thought we were going to re-sign him, but then I saw the contract that he got and it was just I guess that was too rich because they went after a couple other players. So another player I've always been a fan of, Seth, Joel Eriksson Ek, one of my favorite 2-way players to watch in this league. The Selke Trophy probably has his name calling at some point when Patrice Bergeron retires. He signed, obviously, that huge contract over the offseason. I want to say it was 8 years, $4 to $5 million per. It was the term was a lot, but it's worth it when you have an AAV below 6. He's going to be, I think, a steal throughout that deal. And I believe it was this offseason, correct?
Yes. And it was when the report first came out that Eriksson Ek was working on an extension. I think the extension was signed within 3 days. Like
Yeah.
it was very quick. And you look at what Eriksson Ek brings to the table. He is a upper echelon, maybe near the top of the list in terms of defensive forwards and or centers in the entire NHL. He is an uber pest to play against, and he continues to make that more of a thing this year, which is fun to watch from my perspective. And he's added the goals, and now this year he had his first career hat trick against the Winnipeg Jets. And as I alluded to earlier, there's been a little bit of some inconsistencies amongst those lines, so we've seen some shakeups to just try to spring the offense. It worked great against Ottawa with Eriksson Ek centering Marcus Foligno and Kevin Fiala. I think that'll be a line combo we see going forward. And, he does a lot of really, really good things for this team. And is he a true top center? Maybe not, but he's a really, really solid number 2 center for this team. And once they find whoever that top center is, whether it be Marco Rossi or otherwise, he is going to be a problem. And he continues to be a problem as it is, but he's going to be a problem because then all of that top line center pressure will be taken off of him. Wow, and he will just
we'll edit that out.
Yeah. He'll just become even more of a force as a 2 center than he is currently as a 1 center. So he just continues to do a lot of really, really good things. And if there was any fear about regression coming into this year, I think he has pretty effectively quieted that so far.
Yeah, again, he's always been just a fun player to watch on both ends of the rink because, he has a lot of chances on the offensive side, but then he doesn't give a lot back, which is just, that's what makes an elite center in this league. Obviously, with Minnesota, you can't talk about them and not mention the defense just because they've always been one of the stingiest teams. Honestly, I think going way back, with they always had that top 4 that was I know they lost Suter, of course, to free agency. Yep. He was part of that amazing top 4, but that said, man, you still have Matt Dumba, you still have Jonas Brodin. I know he's kind of gotten a bit older, but I think he's still an effective player. Jared Spurgeon, I will always say, is arguably the best defensive defenseman in this league. He always has some of the best underlying numbers in the defense zone. I think his expected goals against or something, or expected chances against, is always among one of the league's leaders.
Yep.
I know you have John Merrill. Old friend Kalen Addison, I believe, was called up just recently. Of course, that was in the Jason Zucker trade, who is having a little bit of a redemption season so far for Pittsburgh. How has that group been? I also noticed that Dmitry Kulikov is still there. That's always been a player that's kind of been a bit weird because most of his career, it's not been as good, but then he also has spurts where it's like, wow, like where did this come from? Like some other players who don't usually get the results at times. But, this is going to be, I think, a matchup for the Penguins that it's going to be hard to score against, especially if Cam Talbot, plays like he did last year, because the Wild's defense, they're so stingy and they don't give a lot in the defensive zone.
Yeah, and you talked about Kulikov, and he is having one of those stretches so far with the Wild. His metrics are near the top of the list in terms of a friend of the show, friend of Locked on Wilds, one of the other podcast hosts here in Minnesota, actually put his numbers together. And he is leading in, and I forget the exact category, but in 5-on-5 even strength situations with a minimum of like 100 minutes played on the year, he is number 1 in a couple of different categories. And I think it's expected goals for percentage, I think is the one. But you look at that, and not only is this defense really good at shutting down opponents and preventing opportunities, these guys are getting involved offensively too. And we had against the Ottawa Senators, every single defenseman had at least one shot on goal. And I think every single defenseman had at least 1 point. in the game. And so those guys are getting involved on the back end, and that is making this team just even more of an offensive nightmare than it was even last year. The numbers in terms of possession for the Wild so far have been ridiculous. You look at against the Senators, the Wild had a shot attempt advantage going into overtime against the Senators of 74-41. And the shots on goal in the third period was something like 17-1 in favor of the Minnesota Wild. Somehow they didn't score, but sometimes you just got to tip your cap to the goalie. But not only are these guys doing everything that we knew that they could do defensively, but they're getting involved offensively as well, which is taking pressure off of Kaprizov, Fiala, as those guys get going this year. And so they're putting everything out there on the ice. So it's been a really fun unit to watch. And it just makes this team even more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, they're always, I guess I know they're not like a mistress team for me. I'm claiming that for Dom. That's it from the Athletic. That's his stuff. But that's always been one of their biggest strengths is just their team defense, and that's been going back. I think even before the Bruce Boudreau era. I want to say it was the Mike Yeo era where they were always good in the defensive zone just because of how the team was set up to succeed. Obviously, they've added more scoring to the lineup. One more, though, I got for you.
Sure.
Has Nick Bjugstad been a lot better this year? Just because with Pittsburgh, it was always that he couldn't stay healthy because we knew the talent was there from him. I also personally think Jared McCann was a better fit for that center spot than him. But for whatever reason, it just couldn't come together. But from what I've seen, at least, I think stats-wise, he's been better this season, and I'm very happy for him. I know the Penguins didn't get a lot back from him in that trade, but his value was also so low, it honestly couldn't have been lower. But it sounds like that he's playing a lot better this year.
Yes, he is playing way better this year, and I think that stems from having a fully healthy offseason. He had the surgery in the offseason in which he was traded to the Wild, and so he came into the year having had to deal with that. And so it took him a while to get going, and he had a couple of nice flashes. But, I was critical of his performance last year with the team. And now this year he has looked really good. And you're on a line with two guys in Nico Sturm and Brandon Duhaime that are speedsters. Like those guys can get down the ice in a hurry. And he is keeping up, and he is helping push the pace on that line with those guys. That line, which now due to, COVID-19 having taken Matt Zuccarello out of the lineup, has been elevated to the third line. But that line with Sturm, Duhaime, and Bjugstad has been the best line for the Wild so far this year. And they really took it to the Senators, as well as basically they have played pretty much all season. And so he's a huge part of that. Like it's not a situation where we've seen in the past, you have two really good players on the line and then you have kind of an anchor. He is doing just as much as those guys are on that line, which has been just really fun to see. Because as you said, he's a fun player to root for, obviously being a Minnesota guy. It's fun to see him have success. And so that has been one of the fun parts of the year for me, is to just see him do his thing. And to really have that pay dividends has been just a blast.
Yeah, I think, every Penguins fan when he was traded was rooting for him just because couldn't stay healthy, and when he was healthy, you could see that the talent was there just because he was such a big body and he would go to the net a lot. It would just be, he'd come in for a couple games and then exit the lineup. It would just be like, okay, what's going on here, right? I think though, Seth, outside of all those, I might be out of questions. I don't really,
All right.
I know Matt Zuccarello is hurt. I think you said he's banged up. Is there any update there with that? Is he expected to play on Saturday, or is he out longer term?
That's a good question. It actually is COVID-19 that has taken him out of the lineup. And so it was Matt Zuccarello. It was also Rem Pitlick, who was claimed off of the Nashville Predators roster before the season started. So those two have been dealing with COVID-19, but I think they are getting close to being able to play. And so if they don't play on Saturday, I would not be surprised if maybe they are activated for Sunday's game. But they're getting close. And the question now just becomes, are they going to be able to have negative tests? Did they have symptoms? We don't really know some of that stuff. So it'll be interesting to see. I have not heard any update yet as to Zuccarello's status, but that'd be a big boost if he is able to come back for the Wilds against the Penguins. But we'll just have to wait and see. And
Yeah,
so
you see, I've been so caught up with all my COVID cases for the Penguins, I just haven't paid attention to it. He was having, I think, a good year before he had COVID as well. So especially he needs to with that huge contract that he signed with Minnesota. I mean, that's a boatload of cash, I would say, that's coming his way. You know, when you're paid like that, you're expected to produce, even though you're in your early 30s at that point. So did not know that he was in COVID. Apologize for that, but I hope that he is back for that game, just because he's always been a fun player to watch, even going back to his Ranger days. Even.
Oh yeah, 100%. We'll tell you what. Let's wrap things up. We have one more break here, but we will finish up our crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Penguins next. BetOnline.ag is back, and they are better than ever. They offer a new web interface for the start of the basketball season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline.ag remains your number one spot for all the basketball and football action this season. So head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Make sure to use the promo code LOCKEDON to receive that welcome bonus. They offer everything from basketball, football, the NHL, boxing, and UFC right to your favorite Vegas casino games. So don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline.ag is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline.ag, where the game starts. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Penguins, the crossover edition, previewing Saturday's matchup between the Wild and the Penguins. Thank you for making both Locked On Wild and Locked On Penguins your first listen every day. And Hunter, just to wrap things up here today for this matchup, obviously, a couple of things from the Wild perspective that concern me that I'll throw out, and you can just kind of counter with how the Penguins handle that situation. One of the biggest things that I think is key for the Wild is the slow start. This team has a tendency to kind of sleepwalk through the early part of the game. They either look lights out. It's either lights out or it's listless. And so, a good indicator for this team, how they're going to do is how they play in the first, 5 or 10 minutes of the game. For Pittsburgh, has that been a concern for them this season, or have the Penguins been able to get off to good starts in most of their games so far this year?
So this is funny. So one of the good friends of the Locked On Penguins podcast, Jesse Marshall, he writes for The Athletic. He always has this saying, you can tell how the Penguins are going to play for the most part, or how the game is going to go with how they look in the first 5 to 10 minutes. And you look at how they forecheck. Most nights, they're forechecking pretty hard, especially with all these players out due to COVID injuries. Some nights, it's a little restless. On Thursday night, for example, they came out flying those first 5-6 minutes. It's like, okay, you could kind of tell how that one was going to go. They kind of got caved in the rest of that third period. Tristan Jarry had to bail them out, but then rebounded in the second. It was kind of a chaotic game overall, but there's the Tampa Bay game, for example, opening night, those first 5 to 10 minutes, honestly, the whole game, Tampa had no ice to work with. Those are really the big indicators of, okay, this is going to be a win, or, if they're not forechecking as hard, it's probably not going to turn up as it goes on. That's just how it is, I think, for this team. So it is a little similar. So I think with the way they come out forechecking, like I said, just watch the first 5 to 10 minutes. That's going to be, I think, the key with Pittsburgh winning this game. It's at home, which helps. This hasn't been an 8-game homestand, something that I don't think that's ever happened at PVG Paints Arena. I guess just is how the schedule turned out, but then they have 12 of their next 16 on the road. So it just evens all out after that. But they'll be fired up for this one. They're coming off a big win against the Flyers. Even though there's a Western Conference team coming in, they're going to want to try to bank as many points as possible. So I'm not too concerned with a slow start. I think they'll be fine with that. I'm concerned with, I think there's been a lot of defensive lapses lately that have kind of concerned me. At the beginning of the season, the first few games, you weren't seeing many of those, but the last few have been giving up too many odd man rushes, some bad pinching at times, which is leading to Tristan Jarry having to bail out his defensive forwards. So if the Penguins can clean that up, they should be in better shape. And the Wild are not a team you want to give a lot of odd man rushes to, I wouldn't say, especially with a player like Kaprizov on the other side. And,
right.
you got obviously Bjugstad's had a good start, and, Eriksson Ek and all those players. So that I think is my main concern going into this. You just got to clean up the plays in the defensive zone, make sure they're forechecking the first 5 to 10 minutes. Maybe this will be the game as well that Kasperi Kapanen decides to come out of the gulag a little bit. So we'll just have to see what happens there.
The other one I wanted to ask about to wrap up is special teams, power play, penalty kill. Power play obviously misses Matt Zuccarello a ton for the Wild. It's been a little bit of an issue over the last couple of games, especially. Penalty kill has also been a problem this year, but I think the problem is more due to volume of penalty kills that have happened so far this season. The Wild have taken a ton of penalties so far. So that is obviously a point of concern for me as well. How have things looked on the power play and the penalty kill for the Penguins so far?
Well, the penalty kill is worlds better than last year. I believe they were bottom 5 in the league last year. A lot of that had to do with the unit, but also a lot of it had to do with Tristan Jarry being one of the worst goalies against the man advantage. I believe he was bottom 5 in goals saved above expected. It was really bad. I think his save percentage was around there as well. This season, both have rebounded, which, they go together, right? So the PK overall is number 1 in the league right now. I know they gave up a goal to Philadelphia on Thursday. That was just their second special teams goal given up in 9 games. So they've been churning pretty well. Tristan Jarry has been able to make some big saves on the man advantage. It's really been night and day last year. That was, I think, one of the biggest concerns for fans coming into the season because, they were able to score a little bit on the power play last year, but they would give it right back with goals against on the PK. It just, You can't win a lot of games doing that. It was a problem going into the playoffs. I know the Islanders didn't have a good power play, but it was still a problem that everyone saw. And, they were able to, I think, work some kinks out. It's looking a lot better this year. I really can't judge the power play too much, sadly, Seth. You're missing Evgeny Malkin. You're missing Sidney Crosby for most of your games. Brian Russ has been out for, I think, the last week and a half, though I think he's expected to come back soon. Don't think it's against the Wild. He's probably going to be close to full contact tomorrow, but I think Sullivan's going to want on him, or the coaching staff is going to want him to do one more full contact after that. I would expect him to see him next week. Jeff Carter's missed games, Jake Ensel's missed games. They have not had their full quintet, on the top power play. So it struggled as expected, though. But the PK has been really good, to say the least.
Well, I'm envious of that. So we'll see what effect that will have, and it should be a good matchup between these two teams. So hopefully listeners got as much of a preview as they would like to get for Wild Penguins coming up on Saturday night. That will take us to the end of today's crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins. So now that your first listen is done for both shows, make sure to head to Locked on NHL to get all of the NHL action you can possibly handle, with recaps and other NHL news as well. Locked on NHL, wherever you listen to podcasts. These shows are also wherever you listen to podcasts, so make sure to check out Locked on Wild and Locked on Penguins. We've got new episodes coming out every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked on Podcast Network.